So yesterday we spent the day in the morning and afternoon talking about how we're stronger together. This morning I was reminded by one of the Niska elders that it resembles, when he thinks about working together, he thinks about his mother and how his mother ran the house and managed the different personalities of the children. And so when he was reflecting back on what happened in the room yesterday, that's what he was reminded of. And I thought that was pretty poignant. And I had not looked at it like that. And I said, for 7:30 in the morning, I guess I got my first lesson. Thinking back to how our mothers ran our homes, how we all had chores to do, how we had different directives. We may not always agree, but we were a family and we worked together. When we think about our fish and our fish resources, maybe we should put that perspective on. We're all working for the same goal, and that's the protection, enhancement, and sustainability of our resources through fish and fish resources. So, think about it like that. When we're working together at different levels of government, we come from different perspectives, but we all have the same goal. We come from different jurisdictions and different understandings, but we have the same goal. We want to preserve and continue to enjoy the resources. And in order to do that, we must all work together. And finally in my life, I can say I'm glad BC's in the room. As a treaty negotiator for many, many years, I never wanted them in the room. I didn't know what they needed to be there for. But in this instance, I'm glad they're here because they have different jurisdictions given to them by the federal government. And they need to be at the table because we need to work together in order to preserve our fish and our fish resources. So with that, that's my recap. Think about your mom when she was directing you as a child and your family and your siblings. When we sit together as different levels of government, and there are still people missing from this table. The table's not fully set yet, but it will be soon. Because this work is long, and it's thoughtful, and everybody's included. I'm going to ask Phil Donnelly to come on up, Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Oceans.
Hey, good to see you.
Can I switch laptops?
No, you can't switch laptops. That's not allowed in my world. But you can have room on
all I
the
need.
podium.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Michelle. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today on beautiful Musqueam territory. And I'd like to thank the nation, and Councillor Nolan was here personally greeting me and us. So thank you to the nation for allowing us to gather here today. I'm especially pleased to join you on the banks of the Fraser River, and that's a waterway close to my heart, and I know important to so many of you. Thank you to the First Nation Fisheries Council for inviting me to speak at the Fall Assembly. I bring greetings on behalf of Premier John Horgan, and it's an honor to attend on behalf of my colleague Josie Osborne, the Minister of Land, Water and Resource Stewardship, and the Minister responsible for fisheries. So my name is Iem Yoyos, which means a strong swimmer in the animal world, or orca. And I'm also known as Finn Donnelly. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Aquaculture for the province of BC. I'd like to start off this morning by explaining why I was given the name Iem Yoyos, which was one of the biggest honors of my life. After swimming the 1,400-kilometer length of the Fraser River in 1995 to draw attention to the plight of wild salmon, the Squamish Nation elders decided I should receive a name and be welcomed into their family. So in 1997, during a naming ceremony in Squamish territory, I received the name Iem Yoyos. And the elders recognized the work I was doing to protect wild salmon, bestowed me with this honor and responsibility. And it was explained to me that the orca are dependent on wild salmon. So if orcas are to survive, there must be healthy wild salmon populations. And as we heard yesterday, wild salmon are in trouble. Their returns have been in steady decline for decades. So my work and our work collectively is needed now more than ever. The First Nation Fisheries Council is a strong voice for First Nations on bringing about transformative change in fisheries. And it's great to see so many council nations here today, including Hugh Breaker, Jordan Point, and other Fnfc council delegates and staff. Each and every one of you is an advocate and a guardian for the incredibly valuable ecosystems that have sustained your people on these lands and waters for generations. Ecosystems that continue to be essential for communities, culture, and economic well-being. At this year's theme, Not Samot, We Are All Connected, speaks to that deep connection that people have with their environments, the lands and waters that sustain us. And I'd like to talk about the work our new ministry is doing and our goals of working in partnership with First Nations regarding stewarding those marine and land ecosystems, watersheds, and the biodiversity they support. So with regard to reconciliation and the implementation of the Declaration Act, I'd like to recall an important time, nearly 3 years ago, when together we made history, unanimously passing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and became the first province to enshrine the human rights of Indigenous peoples into law. Through Section 3 of the Declaration Act, government must, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, ensure new and existing provincial laws are consistent with the UN Declaration. This is woven into the fabric of every minister's mandate and into everything we do as a government. It is the very framework that guides our work in the Ministry of Land, Water, and Resource Stewardship. In fact, one of the top priorities Premier Horgan gave Minister Osborne was developing a path forward with First Nations to build a land and resource management regime founded on the principles of rights and shared decision-making. And my role as Parliamentary Secretary is to support Minister Osborne in advancing this mandate, with a particular focus on working with partners to protect, recover, and rebuild wild salmon populations through our Wild Salmon Strategy and Action Plan. And 2 new initiatives, the Watershed Security Strategy and Fund, and BC's first ever Coastal Marine Strategy. It was a proud moment when our government ratified the Declaration Act, a milestone for Indigenous rights and the accompanying commitment to work together on its implementation. And here we are 3 years later. It's once again a privilege to participate as we launch into the collaborative work laid out in the action plan. That work includes new strategies to protect and recover wild salmon in BC, development of a watershed security strategy and fund, enhanced conservation and biodiversity, including protection of species at risk, addressing cumulative effects, and taking steps to fully establish and consent-based decision-making. I'm pleased to share we are making progress on each of these commitments. I'll start by acknowledging the recent historic agreement with the Tahltan government, central government, as a good example. As the first consent-based decision-making agreement under the Declaration Act, it will provide clarity and predictability for the Eskay Creek Revitalization Project. We've also collaborated on a Together for Wildlife strategy that funds research by and incorporates expertise and knowledge from both First Nations and academia, allowing us to make well-informed decisions about wildlife management. Action 2.6 commits governments to address cumulative effects through stewardship forums, land use planning initiatives, and guardian programs that are inclusive of Indigenous knowledge. As you all know, Guardian programs perform a significant role in stewarding natural resources, helping to protect and restore biodiversity as well as the cultural importance of many places on the land. Earlier this year, it was great to see BC Parks, the Newhulk, and the Kitasoo come together on a pilot project that gives Guardians the same authority as park rangers. This recognition of shared decision-making runs through all of our commitments in the action plan. For example, our collaboration with First Nations on sustainable water management and Indigenous water stewardship, which includes co-developing a watershed security strategy with First Nations, is more critical than ever, given the devastating effects of global warming. We've also established the BC First Nations Water Table to facilitate co-governance on water issues and to address a need for ongoing collaboration on these issues at a province-wide scale. And the table will co-develop the water security strategy and fund with BC. Healthy watersheds are a foundation of all social, environmental, and economic systems supporting British Columbia. Aquatic, wetland, and riparian ecosystems and the species that rely on them, in particular wild salmon, depend on healthy watersheds to survive. We know they are critically important for climate resilience because they can reduce the impacts and costs related to floods, droughts, and wildfires. And that's why we're moving forward with this important strategy to mitigate these issues and ensure BC's watersheds are healthy and resilient now and in the future. Of course, the Declaration Act Action Plan also includes commitments around implementation of BC's wild salmon strategy and action plan. In fact, we've been actioning this strategy for some time now through a broad variety of restorative programs like the Joint BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund with the federal government. The wild salmon strategy protects BC's wild salmon and other fish populations, building on past successes in habitat protection, fish passage, and watershed restoration. Wild Pacific salmon are an iconic species in BC. They are at the foundation of Indigenous culture and way of life, and are an integral part of our province's food security, ecosystems, and economy. Keeping wild salmon populations healthy and plentiful in BC's waters is of critical importance to all British Columbians, and imperative for this government. But here's what we're doing differently. Together with First Nations, we're building on implementing BC's wild salmon strategy while at the same time developing the watershed security strategy and fund, as well as BC's first ever coastal marine strategy. So we're doing that together. We understand how all of these critical issues that focus on healthy water, healthy marine life, and healthy ecosystems are truly connected. And we believe that together they can help heal the land and restore wetland, riparian, and coastal marine ecosystems and ensure wild salmon can return home to spawn. The BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund, jointly funded by BC and the federal government, is a key part of our work to recover, rebuild, and revitalize wild salmon populations in BC. In August, right here in Musqueam Territory, we announced that the province, along with the federal government, doubled our joint contribution to a total of $285.7 million over 7 years to further recover Pacific wild salmon by restoring watersheds and rivers and supporting ecosystems to adapt to the impacts of global warming. Earlier this year, I again joined the Federal Fisheries Minister, Joyce Murray, and others on the territory of the Coquitlam First Nation to highlight some of the projects this fund has supported. And this summer, I visited several BC Shrift projects to see on the ground the benefits to wild salmon populations when we come together. So I'd just like to focus on one particular project that I visited because it was quite moving. I'd like to highlight the work of Norm Allard Jr. of the Yakanui Nation and the work he is doing to restore wetlands in his traditional territory. I was moved by the story that he shared with me. He said the elders told him to spend time on the land and to fix the water problem. He said in all humbleness, he didn't know what to do first. So he started talking with others, and then he just got to work. And he has made tremendous progress over even a few short years. Birds are now coming back to the wetland, water is being retained, and even through the warmest parts of the year, there's still water. He now has 5- and 10-year plans to restore more of their territory, and he's thinking about 25 years. I think it's just amazing from what he started with that direction from the elders, to go down and just be on the land. The province and the federal governments played a small but important role in contributing funding to this work. It's a great partnership. Before I conclude, I want to pick up on Jordan Point's comments yesterday regarding collaboration and the notion of creating a tripartite agreement. You heard yesterday from Rebecca Reed about DFO's Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative and the federal government's plans to implement UNDRIP. You heard from me today about the province's Wild Salmon Strategy and Action Plan and our commitment to DRIPA. And each First Nation has or may have its own wild salmon recovery plan for its territories. So how would it be possible to go from each of those respective recovery plans to one coordinated wild salmon recovery and rebuilding plan for BC? The Nisga'a Nation representatives asked an excellent question yesterday. How are modern-day treaties being consulted and, more importantly, engaged in this process? While this is certainly a huge challenge, I think we can come up with one coordinated wild salmon recovery and rebuilding plan for BC while respecting each jurisdiction's work to date. However, I believe elected leaders must come together to sign an MOU. That MOU, however, needs to be specific to specifically describe how federal, provincial, and First Nation governments will empower their respective staffs to implement one overarching coordinated recovery and rebuilding plan that incorporates each government's and First Nation governments' programs and work on wild salmon recovery to date. So about a year ago, I thought about what this MOU signing process might look like. And I wrote down the steps I thought would be needed to make it happen. I even pursued it with my minister at the time, Lana Popham. And she encouraged us to pursue it with then Fisheries Minister Bernadette Jordan and Parliamentary Secretary Terry Beach. They were interested, and we had a couple of meetings, but as you know, things change. And before we could finalize that agreement, there was an election, and then we had a new federal minister. So I've spoken with this idea with Hugh Breaker and Jordan Point of Fnfc about such an agreement. If a similar process could be done with First Nations, including modern-day treaty nations, I think it would be an incredibly powerful agreement that the federal and provincial governments could not overlook. Once an MOU process is agreed to and implemented, then we would all need to commit to enduring funding. Right, Jordan? So political will is needed. Elected chiefs and elected representatives of the federal and provincial government. Political will is needed to draft that MOU, to implement one coordinated wild salmon recovery and rebuilding plan for BC with federal, provincial, and First Nation governments. Staff at all levels would be needed to draft the MOU, and all levels of government would need to commit funding from their respective programs and budgets to implement this plan. And the reason we need such an MOU, and not to just simply commit to working together in partnership, which we're already doing, is exactly for what the Nisga'a Deputy Chief Counselor said so eloquently yesterday: accountability. These plans must force our respective governments to report the numbers of wild salmon returns. So in conclusion, it feels like we've been saying this for a while now, but it's been a rough year. I don't think any of us could have predicted the unprecedented extreme weather events that have been occurring. It's heartbreaking to see the impacts of drought on salmon, of flooding on fragile habitats. One thing I know for sure, we have to work together on the solutions. This will be generational work. I know that working together to manage those challenges, to address cumulative effects, and to be better stewards of watersheds, the ocean, is our best approach. Our government believes we can achieve meaningful reconciliation, take care of our environment so it sustains our children, our grandchildren, and provides economic opportunity at the same time. I'm committed to continuing that work on this journey with you. Haichkausia.
All right, does anyone have any questions? We've got a few minutes for questions for Phil. Come up to the center mic. Finn. Sorry. Not enough G7 yet this morning. Looking mighty spiffy there today.
Oh, good morning. And by the way, I'm not a young man. I'm almost 59 years old, so it qualifies me
That's
as
still
almost
young.
an elder. Anyway, good morning to you all. Thank you for your speech there. It's wonderful, and I love the idea. And I'm going to start off the way we traditionally start off. Simgigat, kan sigamana, skubuls, kan toy, skubukes, Sam Cardi, Esipnisip, Yokan Willahitsip, Sam Cardi Neat. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I greet all of you, chiefs, matriarchs, and certainly the princes and princesses in the room, and especially our children. I have a couple of questions. One, you announced 85 million for programs and to restoration. I would like to know how the Nisga'a Nation would qualify for some of that money, because we have a lot of restoration that we need done in the Nass and the entire Nass River. One is mainly done by industry, and getting to industry, I would like to see our government and this group here lobby our governments to maybe we should start charging. You know, if you want to play, you should learn to know how to pay, because a lot of damage was done by logging, overlogging. A lot of restoration stuff was that needs to be done. It's because of the silt that was put into the water and killing the eggs. We do have a steelhead problem in North America now, because somebody way back in the day said, well, okay, we're going to save the steelhead. Well, guess what? They started using salmon eggs to fish these things after they were allowed to fish them again. So now the steelhead are predators of the spawning fish. And we've actually seen it on our rivers where the steelhead are just waiting for the salmon to come home, and they just go right behind them and they scoop up the eggs. So that's another problem. And in saying that, you know, I think we have to collectively get together, and like I said, I'd like to see the two levels of government get together and say, well, wait a minute, industry, if you guys have been playing on this land and doing the damage to this land, why don't we start charging you a surtax to help restoration and help out with some of the bills that we have in North America? Because the mining, you got the natural gas people, the oil guys, you know, they all contribute to some kind of environmental hazards to the land. And we've seen a lot of stuff in the United States where you can actually light a creek on fire. The whole creek will catch fire because of the methane that's left behind from the fracking and whatnot. And in terms of the MOUs, I would like to see that, judging from experience from our treaty, when you think about our treaty, it is an MOU. You know, it's a signed treaty, and I would like to see that the levels of government honor those MOUs to the point where they're actually stepping up and not allowing other people to step in on traditional territory to manage and do things on their territory, and have the government fund them to do that. And that's got to stop. That's where the real problem is where governments are signing agreements with First Nations people, and then they're funding other groups to go and interfere with those people. Thank you very much, and you all have a good morning.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And in terms of BC SHRIF, it is open now, so NISCA can apply, or operators within the nation, whether it's nonprofits, they can apply for funding. The window is open currently until, I think, November, mid-November. So there's an opportunity to apply, and that's across the province. So that first window is open to apply for funding to do restoration work. And I think we've had less than 100, like 97 projects over the last number of years that received funding and have done amazing work. And I know that program in its 1.0 was fully subscribed. It was oversubscribed. So it's very, very popular. So I would encourage you to get your applications in at the early part of this 2.0 where the funding exists now. I totally agree on steelhead. We have a huge problem. We've had a problem. Our scientists have been telling us about the challenges of low water and warming water for steelhead and for bycatch. So we need to change our fishing methods in order to reduce the impact. That's a federal responsibility. But you know, the province has a responsibility with the habitat of steelhead. So the issue with steelhead, like salmon, is complex jurisdictions. First Nations operate headwaters of the sea to the ocean. Province, as Michelle mentioned, has jurisdiction on the land, and DFO essentially in the ocean, and management of fish. So very complicated, but that cannot let us not resolve this problem. And to date, it has been, as it was pointed out yesterday. We are not managing the situation well enough to have wild salmon and steelhead numbers thriving into the future. In terms of the idea of a restoration tax, I think that's a very interesting idea. And I think if nations were to come to lead the way in your own nation and to come to the province and the feds, I think this is a really good time to suggest something like that, because right now the courts have been determining, the Blueberry First Nation decision, for instance, on cumulative impacts is very apparent. It's very clear where the courts sit in terms of the impacts to salmon over time and to wildlife in general. So looking at how do we include everyone in the rebuilding and recovery plan, essential. So that might be one way to do it. And finally, just I want to comment on the MOU, because that is, I think we definitely need to continue. Rights and title needs to continue government to government, nation to nation, and including the province. But what I'm talking about in terms of this specific agreement is on wild salmon recovery and rebuilding. So a very specific focus, and that's why I think it's important that we spend time focusing on exactly the wording of what it is we're trying to do and what we're agreeing to. So recovery and rebuilding of wild salmon. It involves the province because that's habitat. So habitat restoration is going to be a part of it, but not everything. So that's where I think nations have to come together with the province and the feds to say, well, what exactly are we agreeing to in terms of this recovery and rebuilding plan?
Iris?
Yes, Madam Cooks. Thank you again for this wonderful presentation. I come from the Nukhalk Nation, and I just wanted to state and reiterate to what some of our people are saying. You know, one thing is that, you know, it's great to have that MOU, or this working relationship, just like the stewardship office with the Guardian Watchman and Parks. And through that, what we did was we went back. We went to the knowledge keepers. And I feel that you're correct in the ways of going right to the nation. And I feel that it should work from the nation ground up. I feel that one thing is that when you guys say this at this level, at the provincial level, it does not trickle down into the reserves or to the communities that we deal with and we live day to day. And I feel that when is that process is going to happen, and how is this going to work with already the MOUs through these different programs that we're already working with. You know, there's so many different levels where it does not even trickle to the nation, or it does not go up to the provincial league. So there still needs to be an understanding and listening to the nations. And when we talk about our struggles, our nation has been we really didn't get to fish this year. There is not much wild salmon in our rivers. And when DFO opened during COVID, opened up our channels for harvesting commercially, it really wiped out our stocks in our rivers. And our watershed is the only watershed that produces in the Central Coast. So how is that going to work with other nations? And how are we going to work with that also when we still struggle with DFO over-contradicting the nations and allowing through the not understanding the boundaries and shared territories, but, you know, just going with one and not the other. I feel that there needs to be more of a ground working level at the nation's level, and you and the provincials need to work into coming in to these nations instead of here. You know, I feel that, yes, there's so many opportunities here and areas, but I feel that coming to the nations and working and looking and seeing what we have to go through. And yeah, I'm really open to working in that way, and also give us the money.
Aichka, Iris. I couldn't agree more with what you just said. Obviously, I'm a big fan of that approach, and I think empowering the nations in territories is the only way forward. And the sooner the province and the federal governments understand that, the better and more productive our relationship and solutions will be. It is obviously not an easy challenge, but it's one that I think we have to do. And just a really quick personal story. Do I have time?
No.
No, I don't. Okay, I don't have time. Michelle's brought the hammer down, but it was about when I did my swim, I was challenged to come back to the nation, and I did. And I think that's exactly what we need to do, is we need to show up, and we need to come back, and we need to work together on those solutions. Guardians, knowledge keepers, wow. We need more of that, tapping those who are looking after wild salmon with those that have had the history and knowledge of the land over decades. So many different agreements, we have to respect those, and I'm proposing yet a new agreement, but even within our government, it's going to be hard to trickle down, because it takes time and effort. But I think if there's anyone that has shown perseverance of over time, it's nations. So you, I think, need to show us the way in many respects. So again, my hands are open, my ears are open, and we need to do this together. I think it's the only way, though.
All right, I have time for one last question, then I'm going to move on to my panel. So if you're a panel presenter, please get ready to come on up on stage.
Thank you, and good morning. Bruce Haldane from Community of Kiroksuk, the Deputy Chief for our community. And I thank the last speaker about consultation with the nations before things happen. And that's very vital for all of us. But I'd like to touch on the restoration. We ran a program many years ago in the Nash for restoration, and I actually worked right in the creeks with when we had funding for it. But it was really harmful for us when the funding ran out. Right now, we need that funding, and that restoration has to, because it's been over 10 years since we've worked in the creeks, and we see the difference and the stocks coming back. We've learned from our elders way back how to restore creeks, and we were taught to look after them. And I'm glad logging was mentioned, one of the main culprits of our streams. And for them to walk away from that was terrible, very, very terrible. It's evident in the Nass, all the log jams up and down our river. They just walked away from that. No one to help us try find funds to make them clean that up. It didn't happen. So we plead to the government, to help us. I remember years ago, we almost walked across the river with the amount of salmon coming up. That's how much salmon we had coming in our river. Now, it hurt us. Many years we had to shut down. Our elders weren't too happy, but they said, you did the right thing. No food fishing for 10 days. Then we open it up for another 10 days. Then we shut it down again. No food fishing for 10 days. We did that for a few years, just to conserve, just so our stocks would come back. And I like that idea of working together, all nations, to understand the meaning of conservation. I don't think everybody understands that word, because we've done it so much in our nation. Our friends, up and down, they don't recognize that. So now, this year, we shut our river down again. No commercial, 10 days, no food fishing. I don't want to see that happen anymore. But we need help to make other nations understand that. That's why I brought up that issue. I brought this issue up in our own. I'm one of the members of the fishing committee in our Nisga'a Nation about the moratorium, how important to me that is, to have a moratorium 1 mile below all spawning streams. We didn't know who to go to. We didn't know if we had that right. And we plead to DFO to accept that we do that. And I'm hoping working together with others to hear our voice with this concern, that it will happen. Thank you.
Hajka Bruce, thank you, and your voice is definitely being heard with me, and I know with our provincial individuals that are in the room here today. More consultation is absolutely key, you're right. Restoration in the Nass, in many areas of the province, it's an amazing challenge because of what has been left and what has been done. And that is why the courts are siding with nations that are saying cumulative impacts affecting salmon and other wildlife. And that has to change. I also think restoration is important. Protection is probably even more important, of protecting habitat. That is absolutely key. So if we can protect habitat and not have to restore a stream, because the ecosystem, we know, will do a much better job. But where we have to, I think we have to step in and restore, and we need money. And you need money, and that message has definitely been heard, Bruce, Iris, for sure. And it's my job, the $285 million with the feds that we've announced over the last, for this 7 years, is a good start. What the feds have contributed with their $647 million is good. We need more funding, and that is going to be my job to go on your behalf. So please give me as much ammunition as you can, because I need to go to Cabinet and battle healthcare, housing, childcare, and all the other issues in the province to get wild salmon up there and restoring and protecting our watersheds. But that is my commitment. That is why I feel I'm in this position, and I'm going to continue to work with you on that. Hajkosiam, thank you.
And from the First Nations Fisheries Council, Jordan has a small gift for you. Thanks, Finn.
Thanks, Michelle.
All right.
Finn, we wanted to, on behalf of the Fish Council, thank you for your partnership and working with us together. And I got to do this, Michelle.
Okay.
Because he said, help me understand this, the finances. So I do want to say to you, Finn, the money that has been allocated and identified, whether it's BC SHRIP or whether it's PSSI, it's not so much about the money, it's about where the money goes and who is making the decisions about where that money goes. I talked to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and talked specifically to her about PSSI. And I don't know if you know this, but when you go through the numbers, probably 67% of that gets cannibalized internally to government. 34% of that money goes external flow to First Nations. When you do the math on that over 5 years and you give $100 million over to BC SHRIP over 5 years, sounds like a lot of money, but it's not really part of the process. What First Nations are saying is they want to be actively involved in determining where that money goes. So you said, give me the ammunition. I'm giving you the ammunition and a better understanding that for us to be putting in proposals and applications for funding doesn't go far enough. We need people meaningfully involved in determining where the priorities are. How much of that? We have bright minds here in the room. How much goes to the Skeena? How much goes to the Fraser? How much goes to the island? That's what First Nations want to be involved in the table, not submitting blind proposals to see what comes out the other end. So I just wanted to impress upon that to you, so thank you for your service.
Thanks. And if I can call Ted, Charlie, Lydia, and Hugh up to the, and we'll just get ourselves organized here. I'd say, I know stumpage is collected in the province. That could be directed to some restoration. Let's think creatively. All right. It's my honor and privilege to introduce the next panel. We have Ted Zimmerman, Executive Director, Water Protection and Sustainability Branch, Minister of Land, Water, and Natural Resource Stewardship. They should have given me an acronym. Charlie Short, Executive Director, Coastal Marine Stewardship Branch, Ministry of Land, Water, Natural Resource Stewardship. And then Chief Lydia Whitsom and Hugh Breaker. Chief Lydia is from Cowichan Tribes, and Hugh is the President of First Nations Fisheries Council. And I believe the order of speakers is Ted's going to start us off. I'm given the rules. The rule says Ted, Charlie, Lydia, Hugh.
Okay, we have a plan. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I just want to express my deep gratitude and appreciation for inviting us here onto these beautiful Musqueam lands this morning. I believe we're probably a little crunched for time, and so I'm going to go fairly quickly through my speaking points just to ensure that we have plenty of time for dialogue this morning. I'll also say thanks so much for the First Nation Fisheries Council for convening this event after 3 years of not being able to hold these sessions and be with you in person with COVID and everything else. It is so nice to finally be here in person and speak to you today. So Parliamentary Secretary Donnelly opened the day today with respect to the provincial approach on a number of key strategies, the watershed security strategy, the coastal marine strategy that that I think really demonstrate this government's true commitment to reconciliation and progress, partnership and co-development with Indigenous nations across British Columbia. And so that is a file that I am accountable for. My staff have been working tirelessly here with our First Nation partners to achieve and advance the watershed security strategy portfolio to really put into effect some elements of governance, of risk assessment, of watershed health, of ecosystem health in ways that we have not done before. And that was a realization from a journey that's probably been 20 or 30 years in the making. As we went through Water Act modernization, ultimately led to the Water Sustainability Act coming into effect in 2016, there was an awareness that notwithstanding the good work that had been done and the consultation and engagement we had done leading up to the actual act coming into effect, that putting that act into force and making, giving us the opportunity to achieve true co-governance and shared stewardship of the land was not occurring simply by the virtue of the mechanics of government and policy outcomes that we would have liked. And so, with that in mind, government made a very strong commitment to develop this watershed security strategy and fund. The intent was to really allow us to look at what we had done right, but more importantly, what we had not done as effectively as we could to achieve better stewardship on the land and to use opportunities to accelerate and put into effect government's commitments to the DRIPA action plan as part of the watershed security strategy. So we'll talk a little bit today, I think, about the water table. It is one of what we call several pathways to engaging and developing outcomes on the watershed security strategy. We're very proud of the work that we've done to date, but there's a lot more work for us to do as we put that strategy into effect and really get things moving on the work that we're trying to do together. So I think maybe in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. I'm sure there'll be more dialogue. I think we have some questions that have been posed to us that will allow us to get a little bit more into the detail on how we've been working together on the strategy. I will say it's been just a huge honor to work with Indigenous leadership throughout British Columbia, with Hugh and with Chief Whitson, on this work, and many other Indigenous leaders in BC, as we contemplate what we want to try to do with the strategy and really advance our co-development efforts together. So yeah, I think we'll probably open it up to some more discussion, and I'm handing the mic now to
Lydia. She's got her own.
I got my own mic.
Shut this off.
No, just leave it. Just put it down. We have qualified people over there.
Yes, ma'am.
Lydia.
Hi, Zebka. Thank you, Michelle. Siyam Nasiaya, respected friends. Siyam Nitsquelmo, all our respected Indigenous peoples. Siyam Nasalhwen, our respected elders. Hi, Zebka, almost all Quail. Thankful for the presence of each and every one of you in this room and all the open hearts and helping hands that have brought us all together once again, acknowledging the First Nations Fisheries Council. Thankful to the Musqueam peoples for making space again in this wonderful pavilion. Just acknowledging my panel members and recognizing the sheer amount of work that needs to be done. I just want to start by talking a little bit about sort of some of the steps that have led us to this point in terms of the work that the First Nations Fisheries Council has done under their Water for Fish. Sorry, I'm kind of behind this for some people. Their Water for Fish initiative. And so I've been engaged in that work. I'd come back and been elected as chief, re-elected again after more than a decade to chief of the Cowichan tribes, just in February of this year. But in 2018, I was engaged with the First Nations Fisheries Council and looking at how to move some of this work forward. I just want to acknowledge there was a lot of Indigenous brilliance and contribution to help us move this forward. Mainly, just by backdrop, in 2018, the First Nations Fisheries Council established a working group, and it was to look at how would we move forward with the development of a First Nations water caucus, recognizing the value and importance of water ecologically, not just from an anthropocentric approach, not just how is it so important to humans. I think the Water for Fish, the title of the initiative, speaks to the breadth of the topic when it comes to water. So looking at how would we establish or move forward with a First Nations Water Caucus as a Tier 1 aspect of moving forward, and then additionally, how would we move forward in a Tier 2 approach with British Columbia with the establishment of a water table across dealing with all of British Columbia. One of the recommendations, again, was to work on a province-wide aquatic resource and establish shared concerns. So when we were having these initial discussions, there was a lot of brainstorming, and some of the early pieces were, if we're wanting to come to the table and we're looking at how to move towards co-development and the establishment of a model that respects Indigenous voice and authority at the table, that we needed to start off from a place of recognition that rights exist, Indigenous peoples hold rights, just to hold that space, because too often Indigenous people come to the table and think, well, we're going to get absorbed in some other authority, but no, it was really critical to establish coming to the table as Indigenous people with Indigenous authority based on our existing rights. So that level of recognition. We dared to talk about things like free, prior, and informed consent. How do we bring forward a model where we understand the application of free, prior, and informed consent as an added value overall in terms of the work that the parliamentary secretary was talking about, in terms of the collaboration, the cross-jurisdiction. I was sitting there listening and I thought, geez, we need a Jordan's principle for our fish, because this jurisdictional aspect is really causing problems. We recognize that with our children, and when I was sitting there listening today, that crossed my mind, because our poor fish are saying, oh, you crossed that line and now you've got another set of rules. So I just wanted to add that little piece in terms of the importance of the work that the Fisheries Council's doing and the Water for Fish initiative. I'm spending a little bit of time on the backdrop so you know how the steps that have been taken. Once we looked at we're moving forward to establish a province-wide table, how would we approach this from an ecological perspective? How do we continue to drive a watershed approach? So we said, let's look at the major watersheds. Let's be driven, certainly at least partly, by an ecological reference point in terms of getting representation to a First Nations water caucus that would be effectively working to represent all watersheds in the province. We have the First Nations Fisheries Council is acting as the secretariat, and so there's still more work to be done. We haven't fully populated the First Nations water caucus yet, but have been drawing in and continuing to do the work to look at making sure we have the right geographical representation, as well as looking at the nations. The First Nations Fisheries Council did convene an interim joint working group to develop the terms of reference for a First Nations caucus, water caucus, and so that developmental work has continued. This included, at that time, 4 nation participants and 4 province of BC participants to do that initial work of setting up an initial framework for terms of reference and setting out an approach that could be inclusive, keeping in mind the underlying principles of recognition of the existing rights of Indigenous people, having an ecological focus, and understanding that this needs to lead to a shared decision-making exercise and through a collaborative process. So the caucus is a Tier 1 space. We set it out as 5 to 15 participants. We want to be able to continue to populate that table, and First Nations Fisheries Council continues to reach out to ensure we're going to build up that representation of First Nations at the caucus. The water caucus works with representatives, not the water caucus, the water table works with representatives of the provincial government and ministries. So they've got, I'm pleased to say, there's a complement of provincial representatives that include not only the work around Minister Josie's ministry, but also looking more broadly at drinking water. How do we bring all of the necessary ministries' interests to the table so we can start to come up with this holistic approach and direction that's so necessary. The water table was created, as I said, as a Tier 2 space to work with the province. The table is comprised of the First Nations Water Caucus, as well as BC's 10 BC representatives from various ministries. Is supported by a secretariat within the First Nations Fisheries Council. So the table is a collaborative structure and addresses water and watershed security, water security and watershed security issues of concern between First Nations and BC through the development of through co-development of a consensus process that upholds the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, reflects the provincial DRIPA legislation and its objectives. And I just want to comment on this piece that when I heard the comments, or this business of, again, parliamentary secretary, your comments about it's hard to trickle down. Well, no, we need direction, right? You don't wait for things to trickle down. You give direction and you follow up. So this, I found that part of the work at the out front end with the province was saying, there is space here, and I had to really focus on, look at your 10 principles for dealing with Indigenous people. Look at the work that's been set out in the action plan, and it really reinforced that it's okay. This is actually the direction we need to go. So this business of the trickle down, I don't want to hear that. I want to hear you gave direction, and we're following up. This sounds like a Reagan model, waiting for some trickle-down effect. No, just to, like, honestly, that is an issue when we're working at the tables, that we get a nice, strong political position with respect to the development of the legislation, the action plan, and a set of targets in terms of alignment of laws, working towards shared decision-making, and taking those steps to recognize Indigenous authority. So, a little sidebar to my notes on that one to just reflect that it's critical. It's a critical piece that we move forward. So with that, moving forward on the update on the current work, the first activity of the water table decided to undertake is the co-development of the water security strategy. And as you may recall, BC, I'd suggest a very, very promising move, had put $27 million on the table. Those resources went directly out to communities, had a focus on Indigenous access to those resources as a priority. And so that continuing that body of work, looking to encourage the further development and long-term commitment of the establishment of a water security strategy with a fund that will continue to support the incredibly good work that happened based on that initial investment of the strategy. I see Michelle coming up. So, so we're working to finalize the terms of reference, the table, both at the Water Caucus and at the Tier 2 water table, focusing on co-development. And the common need expressed by caucus delegates was the need to honor and build upon the work in the past. So I think that'll come up in some of the questions as well. I'm thankful for my co-panelists here and the commitment moving forward with respect to water. I think it's something it's a commitment I haven't seen as strong before coming out of British Columbia, I suggest, in terms of the mandate. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Lydia. Charlie? And if you can just hold the mic directionally to your mouth. Very good. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charlie Short. I'm work with the Ministry of Land, Water, and Resource Stewardship. And as you may have heard earlier today, references to the creation of and development of a coastal marine strategy. And that's one of the tasks that my branch has been given. And I also wanted to say thank you so much for the invitation today. It's been a pleasure being here in Musqueam Territory, and much appreciated about the invitation. Maybe I'll just paint a little bit of a backdrop around where this came from and how we're getting to a place, and I'll shift it over to you, Hugh, so we can get into some of the questions. Back in 2021, there was a commitment by the provincial government to develop the first ever coastal marine strategy for the province, and that might come as a surprise to folks, given the coast and the marine environment is part of our collective DNA here in this part of the world. That sustains us. It's a lifeblood for many communities. Yet we never really had at the provincial level an articulation of what the vision is for how we interact with that coast and how we work together to steward the resources and the values in that particular part of the world. And often how we approached managing those values was sort of in silos. We did water over there, forestry here, wildlife over there, and then marine stuff over here. And so this was an opportunity to kind of bridge that divide, and we've heard from many, many people that that interface zone is extremely important, and there's a lot of tight connections, and one relies on the other. And so there was a call out to develop something like that. And the challenge that was presented was like, how do we, and it's a theme, I think, from today, is how do we all work together to achieve that, given the diversity of values and diversity of backgrounds and the sheer number of folks that are needed to be involved in that process. So earlier in 2022, earlier this year, we invested a lot of time into convening some leadership dialogues around how the province could work with coastal First Nations writ large across the province to develop both a process and a particular product, being this coastal marine strategy. So many of you may have participated in those early sessions. And with the input we gathered through those dialogues, we hosted about a dozen of them or so, we got a lot of informative insight around how we could work together and also sit down and roll up our sleeves and start drafting something, because we didn't really have that. It didn't exist, so it was presented a unique opportunity. And so over the past 8 to 9 months, we've been sitting together with many folks across the province, coastal First Nations across the province, and they're either their organizations or delegates or individual nations to sit down and actually put words on paper and have developed our initial draft of what we're calling an intentions paper around what should we do in terms of developing a strategy. And so it's been a really interesting and fascinating experience. We've learned a lot of lessons through that process, and we're actually working together, and we've made some mistakes too, and we're sharing those lessons, and then we're going to try and work together to craft a process as we move forward, respecting all the various commitments and arrangements that we have across the coast. So I think we're going to leave some space for that and talk about some of those lessons learned and how we're moving forward. So appreciate your time. Over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. Eacham Hugh.
Tlako, Montmas, Tlako, Musqueam. It's always a pleasure to visit here where I have many close relatives. I'm just going to fill in a few points on the water table and water caucus. The water table, of course, includes the provincial representatives and the First Nation representatives. The water caucus is made up just of the First Nation representatives. As I look at the table full of my Niska friends, I'm reminded that there is no representative from Northwestern BC. Nobody has accepted our invite to come sit at the table. Nobody from did you hear me? Nobody from Northwest BC. We have the Skeena representative and, of course, the Niska are on the southern edge of the northern quarter of the northwestern quarter of the province. So I do mention that. There are a couple things I wanted to fill in on with respect to the water table. We have appreciated since day one that there's a huge diversity of interests just among First Nations on the issue of water. There are still First Nations in BC, for example, who do not have clean water. There are First Nations in BC who engage in ranching and have herds of cattle. Their interests are different from the farmers who have vast fields under cultivation or orchards under cultivation. Their interests are different from the fishermen on the coast who look at the need for water in a different way than the farmers and the ranchers do. So we've tried to populate the water table with not just people from the different areas of the province, except for the Northwest, but also with people who have various interests, different interests in the issue of water, so that we could get a wide perspective at the table, not just for the First Nations, but for the province of British Columbia to listen to as well. The water table and caucus meet monthly. We try and keep up. I hope I'm not talking out of space here to the provincial reps, but as I understand it, the provincial reps report directly to cabinet. They have instructions from the government. The government's hoping for some quick initiatives, some quick action, and it's rare that you can have this reporting directly to cabinet on these types of issues. So that does tell me something about the commitment of the province of British Columbia to move on this issue. I was very taken. I went to the AFN Climate Change Conference in Fredericton 3 weeks ago to deliver a paper, and I was very taken by the stories that I heard about the damage occurring in British Columbia because of the drought that we're having this year and because of the heat wave that we had last year. In my view, this is not an issue that can wait. It's an issue that's happening now. The watersheds in British Columbia desperately need a plan. They desperately need attention. I was talking to someone from the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia, and I said, do you think this heat wave's killing the trees? He looks at me and says, they're already dead. There are trees dying now in the various parts of British Columbia because of this heat wave, because of the drought that we're having. And he looked at me and said, do you think the little saplings that the forestry companies plant each year to replace the trees they cut down, do you think those saplings are surviving? No. Large numbers of them are going to die. So my point is that as important as the work of the water table is, and as important as the work is for us to talk to British Columbia about this issue, there's also an urgency to it, an urgency that's already been brought home. Climate change is not coming, it's already here. So I do stress that to the members of the water table, that this is something we really don't have the luxury of sitting down and kicking our heels up and having a long discussion about. It's something that we really have to address rather quickly. The second point I want to make is that the First Nations Fisheries Council is an incorporated society. We do not have Aboriginal rights or title. We're a society. It's you, the First Nations representatives, who have that. It's your voice that must be heard. You must give us direction or come to the water table meeting yourself and let us know what your interests are. We desperately need the voice of First Nations people who have the rights and the title. All we can do is facilitate, encourage the discussion, engage the province, help the province find the direction on the way to go on this issue, but ultimately the decisions are going to come from First Nations. So I did want to make those initial or supplementary comments to what's been made already. I also want to talk very briefly about the coastal marine strategy. You heard Finn refer to it earlier in his address to you. The coastal marine strategy really does not have any boundaries. We're going to talk about stewardship. We are talking about stewardship. We're talking about governance. We're talking about economic benefit for First Nations. We're talking about capacity building. We're talking about protecting the environment, marine protected areas, marine parks. There is nothing that's off the table. Harvesting. And so you will, just listening to that, you will know that we've got a huge overlap. We have not only British Columbia's interests, but Canada has issues as well. So DFO and the Ministry of Transport, the Federal Ministry of Transport, are both involved. I remember a meeting I went to when the Navigable Waters Act of the federal government was being amended about 10 years ago. And the lady from Transport Canada stood up and she said, "We've never had to talk to First Nations before." That told me a lot. And so it's been a bit of a struggle, I have to say, at the Coastal Marine Strategy meeting to get the various ministries on board about UNDRIP and their obligations to us because of the federal and the provincial legislation. I know some of you are going to find this hard to believe. You probably won't believe me, but it's actually hard to get DFO to agree with us. They don't really agree on what their obligation is under UNDRIP or the federal legislation. And so we're having a bit of a struggle sometimes. And again, I'm going to say this once more, it's important that the First Nations have their voice at the table. I spoke to the staff a little bit earlier about the Coastal Marine Strategy, and we all agree that it would benefit us if there were more First Nations coming to the table, that table as well. So if you are interested in that, please, there are some staff here that can come and talk to you and explain the process and how we can get you on the mailing list. I'm really happy with the way that the Coastal Marine Strategy meetings are going. There's a flexibility, especially on the part of British Columbia, and I give kudos to British Columbia for their flexibility in those meetings and their willingness to talk about the various issues that are appearing before the table. And with that, I'm going to allow some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Hugh. I'm glad you're going to allow some time for questions. All right. I have some key questions that I'm going to ask, and then I think that might get us into a little bit deeper understanding of what this panel brings to us today. So in the co-development process so far, what have been some of the key lessons learned, and how will these lessons guide working together moving forward? And I will start with Chief Lydia.
All right, get the easy questions, right? Haichka, Michelle, and again, acknowledging the panelists for their comments. This part, in terms of the moving forward with co-development, one of the pieces that we brought forward was that there's been a lot of work that's been done by First Nations with respect to priorities, water strategies, and so we wanted to ensure that we brought forward all of this body of work. So we looked at the BC First Nations water rights strategy. So the Secretariat undertook the exercise to bring together a whole range of research and documents and direction and recommendations that were given. So looking at also the statement of requirements for water governance in British Columbia according to the Crown's commitments to reconciliation in 2018. We discussed a discussion paper with respect to DRIPA and the high priority Water Sustainability Act reforms. Also looking at the water security strategy and fund discussion paper and feedback from 2022. So one of the first things was let's make sure we're not losing track of all the investments Indigenous peoples have made already in terms of recommendations, work, investment, research, and bring that to the table as part of the body of work moving forward. So when you think about co-development, we bring forward a whole body of work from First Nations that needs to be part of the go forward. I think again, in terms of co-development, there's been, it's a challenge in a way, because in a lot of ways, The Crown is very used to a process of bringing things forward. It's kind of mostly baked. And so I think there's a that we've had to push on that a bit and say, how then do we, in the true nature of co-development, actually take those steps? So it creates a little bit of uncertainty, but it also opens up a lot of space to get it right, in my mind, in terms of the work that we need to do. Also the work in terms on co-developing key pieces of the further development of the watershed security strategy, so being able to be engaged at the discussions at the First Nations Water Caucus and be able to bring those pieces forward to the Tier 2 table with BC. I think there's a lot of learnings that are happening, and we're kind of unfolding some of that as we get this work done at the table. And so I just wanted to make some of those comments in terms of taking steps to ensure when we're looking at implementation of DRIPA, we do look at, does this fit a framework that respects the many paths to self-determination that Indigenous people will take? Does it respect and recognize the existence of the rights of Indigenous people to not only be at the table, but to co-develop? So some of this seems really straightforward, I think, in some of our minds, but the point has been to continue to bring it forward and work with the people at the table. And sometimes it takes a bit of convincing, because we're cracking an egg here of colonialism that is very entrenched. And so that's part of that, I think, hard work and commitment moving forward, continuing to push and make sure that discussion is based on the principles brought forward by First Nation, based on the recommendations. There was an Indigenous Leaders Advisory Council that was established. All Indigenous people had the opportunity to come together and set a list of recommendations to government, to the Crown, with respect to the development of the watershed security strategy, but also looking further at how do we ensure there is a fund and a commitment. So let's just add those to as my kind of understanding of how we're pressing for ensuring there's a co-development approach.
All right, Ted, same question.
Yeah, I think I'll just build on Chief Whitsom's comments here a little bit. Developing a watershed security strategy historically would have been something that government would have done and then gone out and shopped it out to nations and stakeholders and British Columbians in general. And we realized that we had to really rethink the entire process of how we actually run the machine of government in a way that's much more inclusive and meaningful and collaborative than we've ever done before, at least in the water, and I would argue maybe in the natural resource space. So the lesson for us was almost this notion of the role, the actual fundamental role that we as public servants bring to that conversation. How do we actually think differently about what our true role as public servants can be, and how can we basically let our guard down and be willing to have tough conversations in a very trustful and inclusive sort of environment as we develop the approach to co-development and ultimately to co-governance of these values that we're trying to manage. So I think that was one lesson. I think another one was this notion of pacing. So, the apparatus of government is that you need to get in, you need to get a security strategy done, you want to get it to cabinet for endorsement, and you have a certain amount of time to do those things. And what the Indigenous leadership that has been working with us on the table has told us is that pace might not be the pace that we want to operate on. It's going to take time for us to build out and think about and contemplate what we want the strategy to do. How do we want it developed in such a way that it fundamentally meets the interests and perspectives and viewpoints that Indigenous leadership brings. So we've come to terms with that timing difference, I think. We've been able to say, you know what, we can still do this together, we can co-develop together. The steps to get there are going to take perhaps longer than what we had initially anticipated in the process, but that's okay. Much better to do this right, to do it in a paced and sequential way that makes sure that we're listening, that we're patient, that we're empathetic to the nature and concerns, and that we're truly building something together here and not rushing it through simply to meet a test of a timeline. Now, that's not to say that we don't want the strategy to get through and be approved as quickly as we can, because government has given us that incredible opportunity to build this work. So we're just finding that balance. It was a focus point of the last water table discussion, and I suggest that we can find that middle ground where we can both ensure that we're being patient and listening and developing this together, while also showing results and getting the work complete.
Excellent. I like to hear it when government says they're learning to be patient, because anyone in this room that sat in a treaty negotiations would say First Nations have been very patient after 30 years. So that's a good learn, right? We both had to be patient. All right, Charlie, quickly, and then Hugh, and then I'm going to wrap this session up.
Sure, thank you. Well, I guess a few things we've sort of learned over the last, 8-9 months around writing an intentions paper for a coastal marine strategy together across the whole province. And that was it was tricky, because there's, half of all First Nations in British Columbia have coastal marine territories, so that's a lot of nations. And the intent and the commitment was to co-develop a piece of policy that didn't exist. And so when we were convening a bunch of sessions around how to do that, that was actually setting the stage correctly, because we didn't have a baked process, nor did we have a product to throw on the table and say, this is what we want to do. We rather said, how could we work together to develop the process to get to the outcome that was a shared interest amongst the provincial government and many First Nations governments. So that was the kind of, I guess the lesson learned for me was just start on the right foot, right? Get off on a good start, and then people that can help galvanize and build, earn the trust that's needed in moving forward, right? Because that takes a bit of time. And to do that, you need to roll up your sleeves and work together and make mistakes together and be accountable and share that accountability. And that helps build and earn that trust as well. So that was one thing that was critical. It's not perfect. Not everyone was engaged in this process. Yet the final product, I think, was structured in a way that people can see value in continuing and working together on that. Another thing that we learned through that was there is a diversity of commitments out there across the province with respect to government arrangements. We have treaty agreements, we have non-treaty agreements, we have First Nations organizations that work together to convene individual nations, and how do we navigate that when you're in the co-development process. And so that is something we're working on right now to better structure that, so we're respecting all those arrangements, which is just needed, right? We need to do that. And so I think we're on the right path there, that we've convened over the last few weeks actually to structure a process moving to get us to a place where we can leverage those existing arrangements and honor those existing arrangements, and yet still work together collectively. Just a couple other little things. Is just creating the space that we can all be comfortable working together. I think often people refer to that as an ethical space, and that means having resources available to bring people together and having capacities that we can share and skill sets that we can share in the co-development process. And that was a really important piece, because everyone's at different places. And so, but you need to create that shared space so people can feel comfortable in participating in an effort like this. And that just creates efficiencies in our process. So I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to, and we're still learning, right? I think that's a never-ending journey in my perspective, but we're in the process of doing all that right now. And so I'm going to turn over to you for some final comments.
Very quickly, only a couple things to add to what's already been said. Firstly, I think we're going to continue to press the province on their legislation and the importance of UNDRIP. So for example, the terms of reference for the water table is being jointly developed. It's not something that the province is bringing to the table and saying, okay, we've got the terms of reference for you. No, it's going to be passed by both the caucus and the provincial representatives. And I think that that speaks, to me anyway, very strongly about the commitment of British Columbia in this particular case. Number two, there's no cookie cutter approach British Columbia is incredibly geographically different from the northwest coast where we have no representative all the way down to the Okanagan.
That's
It's
3
incredibly
times.
diverse in the area that geographically where the province is, but it's also incredibly diverse among the First Nations and their water needs and their views of the uses of water, from the ranchers that I mentioned earlier to the fishermen and everybody else. And there's also a big difference in how First Nations government structures are. As was mentioned, there's treaties and there's non-treaties, but there's also among the First Nations differences in governance structure. So to use my own area, the Nuu-chah-nulth hereditary chiefs, the Council of Hatwe, have jurisdiction over fisheries. The Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council elected chiefs don't. Fisheries is left up to the hereditary chiefs. So that's a difference in structure that you don't find everywhere else in British Columbia. It's something that we all have to honor and respect. And so there's no cookie cutter approach as to how it's going to be difficult. It's going to be very difficult. We also learned that we need to have a space at the table for those who may fall outside of the area that we've filled the table with already. So we need to make space at the table for people to come forward or First Nations to come forward. We don't have, as I've said at the very beginning, Aboriginal title and rights, and we rely on those First Nations to bring it to us. Last point I want to make is that we do try and respect the work of First Nations done already. The First Nations Fisheries Council has a huge corporate knowledge among our staff and our council, and we try and bring that knowledge to the meetings of the water table. We also rely on the members who sit at the water table and in our water caucus for First Nations. So for example, the member for the Fraser Valley at our last meeting and at the meeting before talked about how he reports back to the Stalo chiefs about what was done at the water table and how he gets input from them. So that's important to us as well. Thank you very much.
Claco Hugh. Lydia would like a minute.
Just taking a moment to, one, continue to acknowledge the good work that's happening with respect to the water table, but I just want to respond a bit to Ted, your comment in terms of it's taking longer. And I think one of the things, because we're tackling something huge here, we're not just looking at the establishment of a watershed security strategy and a watershed security fund, we're also looking at strengthening and rebuilding the governance of nations, to recovering from generations of impact and displacement by colonial law, legislation, and policy. So I don't want that to get tangled up with, we want to get work done. We'd like to be able to see a commitment to a watershed security fund in the 2023 budget. I think the question has been how much is there. So I think there's I just wanted to respond to that we are pressing for the work to move forward, and when we're talking about rebuilding nations, that is part of the work that we're doing associated with this. So when you think about collaboration, consensus, shared decision making, that will take a little more time, but that's going to be enduring. I think that's the important piece, and I really don't want it to be that the First Nations or Indigenous participants are kind of slowing things down and so we can't get done. So I know that's probably not what you meant, but I also wanted to just make sure and be clear that we're still, pressing to meet those targets while continuing to do the really important work of just supporting nations as they take their respective paths of self-determination. So,
Thank you, and thank you to the panel.